On December 15, 2020, the moment had come. In Tokyo, a verdict was handed down that shook the whole of Japan. An oppressive silence reigned in a small, heavily secured courtroom as the presiding judge announced the sentence, death penalty. The defendant, Takahiro Shiraishi, barely reacted. He just nodded slightly as if he had been expecting this moment. No flinch, no objection, just silent acceptance of his fate. Takahiro was no ordinary murderer. The media had long since dubbed him the Twitter killer, a man who deliberately sought out desperate, suicidal people on social media. His promise was perfidious and simple. I'll help you die. 9 young people, 7 women and 2 men believed him. They met with him, and he kept his promise every time. Those who were going through a difficult time and actually needed psychological help got what they wanted. On that cold December morning, Takahiro finally became the symbol of a digital nightmare. In a world where likes, retweets, and private messages were part of everyday life, he used the same channels to find his victims. The brutality of his crimes was as shocking as their systematic planning. The trial lasted only a few weeks. Takahiro showed no remorse, confessed every detail, did not contest any of the charges, and in the end even waived his right to appeal, not out of guilt but out of indifference. I regret nothing except that I was caught, he said. And with that sentence it became clear that this was not a madman, but a calculating murderer. But Takahiro's story began long before the massacre in his apartment. It began in a quiet corner of Japanese society that often overlooked or suppressed mental suffering. That is exactly where the trail led back to, and that is exactly where the story that is now being told begins. Takahiro Shiraishi was 27 years old when the police arrested him in October 2017. He lived alone in a small apartment in Zama, Kanagawa Prefecture, just a few kilometers from his parents' home. The apartment was unremarkable, functional, with a makeshift curtain covering the window and an old mattress on the floor. But behind this facade lay a nightmare that even experienced investigators had never seen before. In several coolers covered with cat litter, officers discovered the remains of 9 people, carefully dismembered, labeled, and stowed away. The air was filled with an almost unbearable smell of decay. A white bag containing personal belongings immediately revealed that one of the victims was Tamura Aiko, a young woman from Hachioji who had been missing since October 23rd. The clue that led to the arrest had been found by her brother. Concerned about her sudden loss of contact, he had searched her social media accounts and found a disturbing chat history. Aiko had written about her suicidal thoughts on a forum. "I want to die but not alone." Takahiro had replied, kindly, sympathetically. He pretended to be an ally, someone who understood her pain. In reality, he had already prepared a location, obtained tools, and planned his next murder. For weeks, the police had been searching not only for Aiko, but also for other young people whose last signs of life could be traced back to the same online platforms. It was a puzzle of disappearances, mental instability, and digital traces, and all the threads eventually led to Takahiro's apartment. Interviews with neighbors revealed little. Some remembered an unpleasant smell coming from the apartment. Others had thought him a quiet, polite young man who rarely had visitors. No one suspected that behind this silence lived a serial killer, someone who systematically led the weakest members of society to their doom. The discovery of the apartment sparked an investigation that not only shocked the public, but also raised fundamental questions about mental health, social isolation, and the dark side of the internet. The first confirmed victim of Takahiro Shiraishi was 21-year-old office worker Miura Mizuki from Atsugi. She suffered from mental health issues that stemmed from years of bullying during her school days. She searched social media for like-minded people who, like her, were contemplating suicide. That's how she met Takahiro. The two met for the first time in August 2017. He had presented himself as an understanding listener, someone who not only shared her fears, but also took them seriously. What she didn't know was that he had already rented a new apartment near Sobudaimai Station, specifically chosen for its seclusion and lack of surveillance. Takahiro persuaded Mizuki to lend him money for the apartment deposit, and just a few days later, he invited her to his place. Once there, he gave her sleeping pills, waited until she fell asleep, and strangled her with a rope he had prepared in advance. He then repeatedly assaulted her corpse, a gruesome combination of sexual violence and total control. In the days that followed, he dismembered her body in the bathtub and stored the remains in coolers. A few weeks later, on August 28, 2017, he lured his second victim to the same apartment, 15-year-old student Hongi Ishihara. She was also mentally unstable and had been searching the internet for someone she could talk to openly about suicide. Takahiro used the same tactics: understanding, closeness, a feeling of connection. The killings were identical: sedation, strangulation, sexual violence, dismemberment. Her parents soon reported her missing. The last location of her cell phone pointed to the same train station area as Mizuki's, but the police still had no connection. The third victim, 20-year-old Takugo Nishinaki, knew Mizuki through social media. He too had struggled with suicidal thoughts and had fallen into a deep crisis after a failed relationship. He met with Takahiro, initially to die, but then he changed his mind. He wrote to Takahiro that he wanted to live. That made him dangerous. Takahiro couldn't risk being discovered. He invited Takugo to his place again, drugged him, and killed him like the others. As his third victim, he stepped up his precautions against the smell of decomposition, buying cat litter, testing ventilation systems, and starting to dispose of body parts at night. But the apartment had already become a morgue, and Takahiro, a man with no way back. After the third murder, Takahiro Shiraishi did not retreat. On the contrary, he seemed almost routine, as if a perfidious rhythm had taken hold of him. His apartment, which resembled a crime scene more than a home, became a trap for further victims. His next target was Hinako Saraki, a 19-year-old student. She suffered from mental health issues, mainly caused by her mother's constant pressure to perform. She sought understanding on social media and came across Takahiro. He played his role perfectly: understanding, calm, trustworthy. On September 15, 2017, while his girlfriend at the time was not at home, he lured Hinako into the apartment, where the same gruesome scenario was repeated: stunning, strangulation, abuse, dismemberment. Shortly afterwards, Hitomi Fujima came into Takahiro's focus. The 26-year-old woman was already divorced, had to care for a disabled child on her own, and was facing another separation. In her desperation, she had spoken openly about her problems on the internet. Takahiro saw this not as a story of suffering, but as an easy target. When she met him, she was exhausted and mentally broken. But an unexpected call from her ex-husband, who suggested a meeting, threatened to thwart Takahiro's plan. Before she could say goodbye, he silenced her, brutally and quickly. To reduce the stench of decay, he built a simple but effective ventilation system in his apartment. He seemed unstoppable. Driven by a dark obsession, he exploited the invisibility of his victims, people whose disappearance raised few questions. Many of them were mentally unstable, living on the margins of society, with no strong family support. Takahiro knew this, and he exploited it, coldly, calculatingly, methodically. With 5 victims now in his apartment, not only did the smell grow, but so did the risk of being discovered. But instead of pausing, he stepped up his preparations. New coolers, more cat litter, better ceiling, and new social media profiles, which he used to contact more potential victims. He was convinced that as long as he controlled who entered the apartment, He was untouchable, but death had left traces, and outside, beyond his locked door, people began to wonder where their loved ones had disappeared to. Takahiro Shiraishi's murder spree had long since crossed every imaginable boundary. But the man who had now killed and dismembered 5 people felt no remorse. On the contrary, with each additional crime, he seemed to become more confident, more untouchable. The apartment, once inconspicuous, was now a silent witness to unparalleled horror. In the fall of 2017, Takahiro turned to the internet again. There, he searched specifically for people who were publicly talking about suicidal thoughts. He knew that those who seek death ask no questions. Those who are desperate are easier to control. One of his next victims was a 25-year-old man who had fallen into a deep depression due to family conflicts and financial problems. He had been looking for someone on a platform who would accompany him in his suicide. Takahiro responded promptly, with false compassion and insincere sympathy. In reality, he wanted only one thing: control, and another victim. As with the others, he had prepared everything. The man was drugged, murdered, dismembered, and finally stowed away in one of the prepared boxes. 2 young women followed, both in their early 20s, both with mental health issues, both single. Takahiro had approached them independently, read their stories, mirrored their fears, and convinced them to trust him. What they didn't know was that they were entering the apartment of a man who had long since lost all hope and knew only violence. One arrived late in the evening, the other the following morning. Both died within 24 hours, and both were disposed of by Takahiro with the same coldness as his previous victims. The 9th and last person on his list was a 17-year-old schoolgirl. She had written about bullying and isolation on social media. Takahiro contacted her via a newly created profile. His words sounded reassuring. He promised her a place of understanding, a safe space. But it was a lie. When the girl entered his apartment, he had already prepared everything. She was the last one whose remains ended up in one of his boxes. The 9th box was full. A 10th was already waiting. But it remained empty. Because before Takahiro could find his next victim, something had changed. The police were on his trail. Too many missing persons cases, too many last signs of life in the same area. And finally, a clue that would change everything. The police had gradually recognized a pattern. 9 young people had disappeared without a trace within a few months. All of them had previously talked about suicide on social media, and the same area kept cropping up in their last digital traces, the vicinity of Suba Daima Station in the city of Zama. When a young woman finally agreed to meet an anonymous man on Twitter, his messages became increasingly sinister. Something about him seemed strange to her, and she decided to inform the police. In close consultation with the investigators, she did not cancel the meeting. Instead, an undercover team, including the brother of one of the missing victims, accompanied the operation. On October 30, 2017, the surveillance unit spotted a slim man with long black hair. He appeared to be waiting for someone. The officers followed him inconspicuously to a 2-story building less than 800 meters from the train station. When the man entered the house, the investigators did not hesitate. They knocked on the door. A foul odor hit them. The man opened the door calmly, without resistance. Inside, the police discovered a scene that shocked even experienced officers. There were 9 large boxes in the apartment, filled with body parts. In one corner was a freezer covered with cat litter. Inside were 9 human heads and hundreds of bone fragments. The walls were bare. In the bathroom were the tools used to carry out the murders: ropes, saws, handcuffs. The man showed no remorse. He answered calmly when asked, "I killed them all. It was easy." The man's name was Takahiro Shiraishi. He was 27 years old and unemployed. He had been carrying out a bloodbath in his apartment for months without arousing the suspicion of neighbors or authorities. There had been a foul odor. but it had been attributed to the sewer system. On November 9th, the police identified all 9 victims using DNA tests. They were young people between the ages of 15 and 26. Almost all of them suffered from depression or other mental illnesses. All of them had turned to the internet in desperation and found their killer there. The trial began in the fall of 2020. Takahiro made a full confession. He regretted nothing except that he had been caught. His defense attorney tried to argue that he was mentally ill, but the court saw no mitigating circumstances. On December 15, 2020, Takahiro Shiraishi was sentenced to death. He did not appeal. 3 days after the verdict, he stated that he did not want to be a burden to anyone anymore.